June 4, 1944. The wind had been slamming the English Channel for 3 days. It rattled the windows of the small limestone house that had been requisitioned as a makeshift operations room near Southwick. Inside, the light was electric and merciless. A single bulb over the long table threw the faces of men into carbuncled shadow, while paper charts curled at the edges from damp and steam. The smell of black tea and cigarette smoke hung in a gray layer across the room like exhausted cloud. It was not a room for easy decisions. It was a room for necessary ones. Group Captain James Stagg stood with his back to a map the size of a door. He was short, precise, with a pipe clenched but unlit between his teeth. The map was a topography of pressure systems, tight isobars, a trough swinging east across the Atlantic, a low-pressure system that had built into near-temperate fury. Stagg's gloved finger traced the curve of the trough as if steering an invisible ship. Around him, young meteorologists, Navy men in wet greatcoats, RAF sergeants folding up data forms, fed him telegrams from shipborne weather stations, SUNOP reports from buoys, radio returns from reconnaissance flights that had been battered by sea spray and wind. Each sheet of paper was a voice. Each voice said the same thing. The Channel was angry enough to cancel anything that required silk and canvas and small boats. But the invasion timetable was a machine already wound. Convoys lay hidden in the Solent. Gliders and paratroopers were poised. Radios primed for a dawn that was scheduled, not guessed. General Dwight D. Eisenhower's headquarters lay only a few miles away in a converted manor. The Supreme Commander had slept badly, the lines beneath his eyes like contour lines of his worry. He had called the weathermen in. He had to know whether the wind would die, whether the tide would fall where he needed it to, whether the Luftwaffe would be grounded by the sea's temper, or whether the invasion would drift into a maw of misfortune and shipwreck. Outside, the rain made the world a silver sheet. Inside, a thermometer clicked down and a receiver ticked up with barometer readings from the western approaches. Stagg talked in time-lashed sentences. Low centers moving eastward. Significant gale. Northwesterly flow persisting. However, a brief shallower ridge will build from the west on the night of the 5th. He said ridge, and the room inhaled as if it had been given a wine. A ridge, a temporary easing in the pitching, a lull. It would not be perfect. The seas would still be rough, the sky smeared with cloud, the westerly swell would still throw the landing craft. But the models, the hard, angry geometry of barographs and synoptic charts, were whispering of a narrow window late on the 5th and into the early hours of the 6th. A window wide enough for the Armada to run across, how narrow? Eisenhower asked. He stood to one side of the map, tall in the halo of the lamp, the cigarette between his fingers forgotten. He did not look like a man who liked to be surprised. Around him were admirals and generals. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, face like granite, thumbs fiddling with a weather chart. Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, maps stained with coffee. The planners who had imagined every contingency now forced to believe in a thing that could not be controlled. Weather. Stagg's voice did not carry flourish. 2 to 3 days improvement. Not calm sea state. Reduced cloud base over portions of the Channel for a few hours. Enough for bombing and limited airborne operations. Possibly enough for a cross-channel assault at dawn on the 6th. There were other voices, lower and raspy. Forecasts were not votes. They were probabilities with patience. Some in the room, younger officers, engineers who had to reckon with concrete obstacles and steel obstacles and the mechanics of 5,000 landing craft, could not be consoled by a ridge. They wanted certainty, a flat sea, clear skies, a tide that would place men on the sand at the drawn-up point. The sea would not offer that. The Luftwaffe could still feel the weather as an ally. Low clouds and rain would ground fighters and protect convoys, but the same weather would pull men apart at the moment of landing. As the debate rose, Stagg produced the thing that cut through ranks and opinions, the reconnaissance reports from the Atlantic. He had ordered reconnaissance flights to probe the teeth of the storm despite the odds. Pilots returned with stories of instrument needles spinning, of altimeters hunting for a fix, of spray that froze on instrument panels. One pilot, young, halting, with the gravel voice of a man who had seen what that ocean could do, thrust a folded photograph into Stagg's hand, a 20-mile stretch of sea where white-capped waves looked like the backs of a wounded herd. The pilot's margin for error had shrunken to inches. "We found a gap," the man said. "It's short. It's ugly, but it's there." Far to the east across the channel, German defenses crouched behind concrete and wire. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months converting Normandy into a fortress. His men had built obstacles, anti-tank stakes, mined the beaches and scarred the sand with wooden stakes and hedgehogs. Rommel was a careful man, and he had been vocally scornful of any forecast that promised a cross-channel invasion through a gale. He had ordered units to remain mobile, expecting the Allies to wait for weather to calm. Rundstedt and other commanders had their own assessments, their own conviction that nature would be their ally. Within the Allied room, the question was also moral. Eisenhower was a commander who should not risk a continent on a whim of wind. He could not send thousands of ships and men into a circumscribed chance. He studied Stagg's face for confidence, for the small clue that a man like him could offer when he believed in a forecast. Stagg, who had spent years reading the sea as a chessboard, offered no bravado. He offered statistics and the threat of a ridge that might, in a few hours, pull the worst of the storm's teeth away from a narrow corridor of sky and sea. "You know the implications," Ramsey said. The admiral's voice rolled like a wave. "If we go and the weather breaks, or if we wait and it remains foul, there are lives and ships at stake." Eisenhower nodded once. In his pocket, a folded message lay like a stone, the order that would open an invasion or postpone it. He could be a man who waited until the stars aligned. He could be the man who trusted a weather map and a meteorologist with a pipe. Outside, the channel kept its dark cadence. Inside, paper breathed and hands moved. The hour had become a scalpel. June 5, 1944, 3:30 hours. The rain had turned from vertical to horizontal, lashing the canvas tents and the polished wings of C-47. Transports parked on airstrips from Dorset to Devon. The wind howled through guy ropes and shook the tarpaulin, covers over stacks of paratrooper gear, rifles, canteens, shoot packs, and those little musette bags that every man had stuffed with chocolate, letters, and photographs from home. The sky over southern England was a single bruised color, the kind that promised neither dawn nor mercy. In every camp, men waited in a tension that couldn't be drilled out. The invasion was supposed to begin hours ago. Convoys had been told to stand by, engines off, radio silence in effect. Landing craft bobbed in harbors, their crews soaked to the bone. Some soldiers had already boarded and been ordered back to shore when the news filtered through. Postponed 24 hours due to weather. The order moved like a ghost down the rows of vehicles and over the faces of men who had rehearsed this day for months. At RAF Southwick, the lights were still on. Eisenhower was back in the same room, coat thrown over his shoulders, his face heavier now from sleeplessness. The forecast had worsened overnight, gales gusting above 40 knots, waves cresting at 12 feet. Stagg was there again, quiet but unflinching, flanked by naval meteorologists who looked more like shipwreck survivors than scientists. "The system deepened faster than expected," Stagg said, gesturing to the inked map. "But the core of the storm will pass eastward tonight. After that, conditions should begin to improve rapidly." The words were careful. Should begin. For a man like Eisenhower, every verb was a burden. Admiral Ramsey leaned over the table, pointing with a pencil to the invasion routes across the channel. 5 lanes that led to beaches labeled with color and code. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. "We can't keep the fleet in these conditions," Ramsey said. "If the swells don't kill them, the seasickness will. Landing craft will scatter." His tone was flat, naval, full of salt and pragmatism. But Stagg pressed on. "After midnight, the winds will drop. The cloud ceiling will rise to 3,000 feet. Visibility improves marginally. Enough for bombers to find their targets, enough for gliders to land." Then he drew a circle with his pen, a tiny eye of calm inside the storm track. "A temporary ridge here. It will last no more than 36 hours. If you go after that window, the next opportunity is not until the 19th. The 19th. 2 more weeks of delay, 2 more weeks of secrecy to maintain, 2 more weeks of restless men and hidden ships." It was unthinkable. Even the tide would turn against them, literally. The moon's pull would not align again for another fortnight. The engineers had planned every second of the landings around low tide, when the obstacles on the beaches would be visible. The operation could not simply be paused. It would have to be rewritten from scratch. Eisenhower stood by the map, jaw set, his mind grinding through the numbers. Tides, winds, moonlight, morale. The storm had already robbed him of one night. Could he risk another? He turned toward Stagg, who was still reading his instruments like scripture. If you were a betting man, Group Captain, Eisenhower said softly, what odds would you give me that we can go tomorrow? Stagg didn't hesitate. I'd bet my life on it, sir. For a moment, the room was utterly still except for the wind pressing at the windows. Then Eisenhower nodded almost imperceptibly. Very well, he said. We'll go. At 04:15, the message was transmitted through coded channels to every division, every port, every airborne base across southern England. The invasion will proceed on June 6th, launch H-hour 0630. Far across the channel, at La Roche-Guyon in France, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not there to hear it. He had returned to Germany the day before to visit his wife and present Hitler with his assessment. No invasion possible for at least 2 weeks due to weather conditions. His staff officers, Jodl, Rundstedt, and their coastal commanders, agreed. Reports from the Luftwaffe weather stations in Brittany confirmed the channel was impassable. They relaxed their alert status. Some units were given permission to stand down from their posts. Ammunition trucks halted along forest roads. Senior officers drove inland for staff conferences. Even the 21st Panzer Division near Caen was released for training exercises. In Normandy, the beaches slept under mist and rain. The sea was gray and violent, slamming into Rommel's steel hedgehogs and wooden stakes. German sentries huddled in their concrete bunkers, warming their hands around tin cups of ersatz coffee. They grumbled about the cold, about the boredom, about the futility of standing guard in weather no sane army would attempt a crossing through. The English will not come in this, one of them said, tapping ash from his cigarette. They'd drown before they reached the shore. His comrade laughed. Maybe the Führer ordered the sea to fight for us. They didn't know that across that same sea, the largest armada in human history was already assembling. By dawn of June 5th, the ports at Plymouth, Weymouth, and Portsmouth were alive with the low thunder of engines. Destroyers and minesweepers cut through the whitecaps, signaling with Aldous lamps and radio bursts. The air reeked of diesel, salt, and fear. The men aboard the landing ships looked toward the gray horizon where France lay invisible, and waited for orders that had just changed the world. On board USS Bayfield, flagship of the Utah Beach Assault Group, Admiral Don Moon leaned over the railing, rain stinging his face, as he read the signal from headquarters. All ships proceed as scheduled. Around him, the channel seethed. But the order was given, and the tide, literal and historical, had begun to turn. June 5th, 1944, late afternoon. The gray Atlantic seemed to breathe. Great lungs of wind and wave rising and falling beneath the steel bellies of the invasion fleet. 5,000 vessels now moved as one vast organism across the channel. Minesweepers ran first, their decks slick with brine and oil. Behind them came the destroyers, their wakes cutting white scars into the water. And then, stretching to the horizon, came the landing craft, blunt-nosed, low-slung, carrying soldiers who had spent the last hours staring into waves and wondering if the weather would kill them before the Germans did. On board LST-289, bound for Omaha Beach, Private Tom Riley of the 29th Infantry Division clutched his helmet against the spray. The air stank of vomit and fuel. Every few minutes, a wave slammed against the ramp hard enough to make the steel moan. The men were packed shoulder to shoulder, their rifles sheathed in oilcloth, their faces pale under the flickering red lights. Over the roar of engines came the voice of the coxswain. Keep your gear tight and your guts tighter, boys. We're making history through a hurricane. They didn't laugh. The sea was too loud, the sky too low. The storm hadn't entirely passed. Stagg's window was real but narrow, like a wound that hadn't closed. Rain still blew sideways across the decks, and the crests were high enough to knock smaller craft sideways. One by one, seasick men leaned over the rails, their helmets clattering to the deck. Officers walked the lines, shouting over the wind, checking weapons and radio packs. The channel, Eisenhower had said, would be their highway. But tonight it looked more like a graveyard. Above them, the air assault had already begun. Shortly after 2300 hours, hundreds of C-47 Dakotas lifted from English fields, engines coughing through the mist. Each plane carried paratroopers from the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, men weighed down with parachutes, rifles, demolition charges, and maps memorized by heart. In the darkness of the fuselage, red lights glowed over faces smeared with black grease paint. Sergeant Bill Hester checked his static line for the 5th time, muttering a prayer that couldn't be heard over the drone of the engines. Somewhere below, a lightning flash illuminated the sea like a camera bulb, an omen, brief and terrible. The pilots fought turbulence so violent that altimeters jumped by hundreds of feet in seconds. "Hold it steady," shouted one co-pilot as his aircraft lurched sideways. The formation broke apart. Navigation lights disappeared into cloud. Over the Cottontan Peninsula, flak began to climb, orange flowers blooming in the night. Paratroopers leapt blind, some blown miles off course, landing in flooded fields or hedgerows. Many drowned under the weight of their gear. But others, small groups, fragments of companies, began fighting within minutes, cutting telephone lines, ambushing German patrols, seizing bridges. In chaos, they made a kind of order. The storm had scattered them, but it had also confused the enemy. The German radar stations at Cherbourg and Le Havre reported scattered contacts, a few aircraft, possibly decoys. Rommel's meteorologists insisted the main invasion was still impossible. Out at sea, the main body of the fleet pressed forward. The destroyer HMS Tartar took a heavy wave over the bow, nearly flooding her forward gun deck. Nearby, an American transport ship radioed for assistance. Men were being washed overboard. Yet the formation held. Admiral Ramsey's orders were absolute. Maintain position no matter the cost. The moon was now visible through gaps in the cloud, silver and indifferent, lighting the rain like shards of glass. From horizon to horizon, ships stretched as far as the eye could see. 132,000 men and 7,000 vessels moving through weather that only hours before had been judged suicidal. At 01 Nacht on June the 6th, the first radar echoes appeared on German screens along the Normandy coast. Operators at the Naval Command Post in Cherbourg reported faint returns, possibly small craft. The duty officer yawned, unconvinced. "Fishing boats, perhaps," he said. "In this weather? Nonsense." Still, he made a note in the log. By 02:30, the blips multiplied, and someone finally called the duty commander. His response was a shrug. Impossible. Even the Führer's birthday parade wouldn't make them cross in this gale. But the impossible was happening. At 03:15, the minesweepers reached their designated sectors, clearing narrow corridors through the channel's minefields under cover of darkness. Sparks from their sweep cables glowed briefly in the wet air. Behind them, transport ships dropped anchor and began lowering landing craft into the churning sea. Winches screamed as the small boats hit the water, rocking violently. Men climbed down cargo nets, rifles slung across their backs, boots slipping on wet rope. Some never made it, vanishing into the black waves below. Captain Howard Weller of the 1st Engineer Special Brigade watched from the deck of Samuel Chase as his men prepared to load into LCAs. The wind whipped his map out of his hand and sent it spinning into the sea. He didn't need it anymore, and everything was committed. "Tell them to keep their heads down," he shouted to his sergeant. Next stop, France. Back on the French coast in the village of Bernières-sur-Mer, German sentries sheltered under their gun emplacements, eyes half closed against the spray. Their radios crackled with static. Somewhere inland, a phone line connected to 7th Army headquarters rang unanswered. The sea had drowned all sense of pattern or prediction, and then through the hiss of rain and wind came a sound that didn't belong. A low, rhythmic growl like thunder rolling across water. One soldier stepped out of his bunker, peered into the gray void, and froze. Out there, just beyond the whitecaps, he could see a line of shadows forming. They were too big for fishing boats. Too many to count. The sea was full of them. He turned to shout a warning, but by the time the alarm bell began to clang along the coast, the first Allied shells were already in the air. June 6, 1944, 05:25 hours. The first light crept over the horizon, a dull red smolder behind the gray surf. The storm clouds still hung low, shredding themselves against the wind, but the sea, by some miracle, had eased. It was not calm, but it was survivable. The meteorological window that James Stagg had promised had arrived exactly as predicted. Narrow, brutal, but real. Out in the channel, the battleship USS Arkansas fired the first salvo. The thunder of its 12-inch guns ripped through the dawn, a sound so deep it seemed to shake the marrow of the world. The shells screamed overhead, vanishing into the mist before slamming into the Norman cliffs miles away. Within minutes, the entire horizon erupted. Cruisers, destroyers, and monitors pounding the coast in a storm of iron. The earth itself seemed to roar back in protest. For the men in the landing craft, there was no grandeur, only chaos. Spray and smoke blurred the world to gray. Each explosion sent rainwater and grit splashing into their faces. "Keep your heads down," shouted Lieutenant James Brady, standing near the bow of his LCVP. Around him, the soldiers of Company A, 116th Regiment, crouched behind the metal shield, their rifles clutched like lifelines. The coxswain's knuckles were white on the tiller. "2 minutes out," he yelled. Through the mist, the beaches came into view, not as lines on a map, but as a living wall of fire and wire. German machine guns dug into concrete pillboxes had survived much of the bombardment. The first landing waves were already being shredded. Men waded into chest-deep water only to vanish under bursts of tracer. The sea turned the color of rust. Boats burned. Smoke drifted across the surf like torn cloth, and yet, somehow they kept moving forward. At Utah Beach, the current had pushed the landing craft nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended zone, directly away from the strongest defenses. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the only general to land in the first wave, splashed ashore with a cane in one hand and a pistol in the other. When his officers told him they were in the wrong place, he grinned through the rain and said, "We'll start the war right here." His calm steadied everyone around him. Within hours, the beachhead was secure. At Omaha, it was hell. The weather had delayed the landing craft, the air bombardment had missed its targets, and the tide was rising fast. Every inch of the beach was exposed to fire from the bluffs above. Sergeant Bill Hester, the same man who jumped into France hours earlier, could hear the artillery from miles inland, a steady rhythm like a giant's heartbeat. "They're on the beaches," someone said beside him. "God help them." Back at sea, the naval officers strained through binoculars. The waves made accurate fire nearly impossible. "They're bogged down," said a British spotter aboard HMS Belfast. His voice was hoarse from shouting. "They're stuck in the surf." Ramsey's reply came cold and flat. "Then we keep shooting until they're not." And so the ships kept firing, turning gun barrels red hot, sending shock waves rolling across the channel. Further east, the Canadians of the 3rd Division slammed into Juno Beach amid 8-foot swells. Their landing craft bounced so violently that several ramps jammed on impact, forcing men to leap over the sides into water above their heads. Yet by mid-morning, despite heavy losses, they had punched through the first line of defenses and were advancing inland. At Gold Beach, the British engineers waded ashore carrying minesweepers and flamethrowers, cutting through wire and blasting bunkers open one by one. Even the sea itself seemed uncertain whose side it was on. At 06:30, as the full light of morning broke through the clouds, the storm finally relented. For the first time in 3 days, the wind slowed, the waves eased, and a pale strip of blue appeared overhead. The meteorological ridge, that fragile pocket of calm that Stagg had foreseen, had opened directly above the Normandy coast. It was as though the world itself had paused to watch what humanity would do next. German communications were in disarray. The 7th Army headquarters at St. Lo received conflicting reports. Some said paratroopers were raiding villages. Others said an entire fleet was off the coast. At 07:00, a radio operator finally connected to the naval command post at Cherbourg. "They're coming through the storm," the voice on the other end shouted. "Thousands of them!" Landing everywhere. The officer in Cherbourg swore. "That's impossible," he said, echoing the same arrogance that had lulled the German command 2 days earlier. No one would attack in this weather, but someone had. By mid-morning, as the first Allied tanks crawled ashore from their amphibious carriers, the wind shifted again, fresh squalls sweeping across the beaches, waves pounding the wreckage. It was as if the channel had woken back up, angry at being crossed. Yet it was too late. The Allies had landed through the storm. The foothold was theirs. At RAF Southwick, Stagg stood outside in the courtyard, face upturned to the rain. He could hear the distant rumble of thunder. Or was it artillery echoing across the sea? A young officer came running from the operations room, breathless. "Sir, confirmation from the fleet. They're on the beaches." Stagg exhaled slowly. His shoulders sagged under exhaustion and relief. "So," he said quietly. The window held. Behind him, Eisenhower emerged from the building, his cap pulled low against the drizzle. He said nothing at first, only stared toward the horizon that hid France. Then he looked at Stagg, the man whose judgment had turned a gamble into a victory. "Looks like your weather's good enough for fighting," he said. Stagg nodded. "Just long enough, sir." And with that, the storm that had once threatened to destroy Operation Overlord had instead become its greatest ally. The veil that hid an armada, the enemy's blindfold, the tempest through which freedom came ashore. June 6, 1944. Away those hours. At La Roche-Guyon, the headquarters of Army Group B, the thick stone corridors echoed with disbelief. Messages from Normandy came in fragments. Airborne troops south of Carentan. Heavy naval bombardment near Caen. Large enemy landings reported near Bayeux. A German colonel shoved a dripping map onto a conference table, where several officers stood in half uniform, still buttoning tunics and strapping on pistols. The phones rang non-stop. Radios hissed with static. But the one man who might have cut through the confusion, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, was 200 miles away. He was, at that very moment, somewhere between Ulm and Herrlingen, stuck in a traffic jam caused by a Luftwaffe fuel convoy. His aide-de-camp, Captain Lang, remembered the marshal's face when the car radio finally crackled with the voice of a panicked staff officer. "Herr Feldmarschall, the invasion has begun. The enemy has landed in Normandy." Rommel stared out the window for a long second before answering. "In this weather?" he muttered. "Impossible." Then quietly, "Or perhaps brilliant." Back at headquarters, his subordinates had made the same mistake that had lulled the entire German defense into complacency. They had trusted their own meteorologists. Days earlier, the Luftwaffe Weather Service had reported sustained gale force winds across the Channel, with no sign of improvement for at least a week. Their conclusion, stamped and circulated through every regional command, and read, "Major amphibious operations in the next 10 days are impossible." To the German generals, it was comforting news. The Atlantic Wall could rest. The Allied air raids that had intensified in late May were dismissed as harassment, not prelude. Rundstedt himself, the elderly commander-in-chief west, had told staff on June 4th that no rational enemy would attempt a crossing through such seas. The men believed him. Orders were relaxed. Some coastal batteries stood down for maintenance. At Pointe du Hoc, several artillery crews were away at breakfast when the first American Rangers scaled the cliffs. In Paris, at the Hotel Majestic, where the Oberbefehlshaber West maintained its communications staff, officers laughed when reports first came in. One lieutenant even joked that the British must have gone mad, sending their men to drown before we have to shoot them. But as the hours passed, the laughter stopped. Radar plots confirmed it. The Channel was alive with ships, and not dozens but thousands. It was an invasion on a scale so vast that even Hitler's worst paranoia had never fully imagined it. By 10 the German command network was collapsing under the weight of disbelief and delay. Hitler had not been awakened. His staff at the Wolf's Lair refused to disturb him until confirmed reports arrived. When the confirmation finally did, just before 10:30, the Führer's first reaction was that it was a feint. The real landing will come at Calais. He ordered the Panzer divisions held in reserve. The 12th SS Hitlerjugend and Panzer Lehr divisions sat in their motor pools, engines off, waiting for orders that never came. The one man who might have countermanded that paralysis, Rommel, would not reach his command post until evening. By then, the beaches were secured. On the Normandy coast, German officers stood on the bluffs, staring through binoculars at the impossible sight before them. The sea, still rough and glittering with wreckage, was thick with Allied vessels, a floating city stretching to the horizon. Waves of landing craft churned through the surf, bringing fresh troops, tanks, and trucks ashore. Above them, squadrons of Spitfires and Thunderbolts droned through clearing skies, strafing anything that moved. The rain had stopped, the clouds were breaking, and the Allies were now pouring through the very storm that had shielded them. At the radar station in Douvres-la-Délivrande, Lieutenant Klaus Bremer stared at his instruments in disbelief. "We never saw them," he said. "Not until they were here." His commanding officer slammed a fist onto the table. "Because the weather blinded us, you fool." The storm masked their approach. But it wasn't just the storm, it was arrogance. The Germans had believed that nature itself would fight on their side. They had forgotten that nature can betray any master. That afternoon, as Rommel's staff cars finally arrived at La Roche-Guyon, the marshal stepped out into a garden drenched from the previous night's rain. He paused under a dripping archway, listening to the faint rumble of artillery rolling in from the west. His face was pale, his uniform mud-spattered from the drive. "Where are they strongest?" he asked. "Everywhere, Herr Feldmarschall," came the answer. "They're everywhere." Rommel looked to the sky, where a break in the clouds revealed a sliver of sunlight. "So," he said softly, almost to himself, "the English have found their weather prophets." Then turning to his aides, "We underestimated the sea, and the men who listened to it." In that moment, the realization spread through the German high command like a contagion. The Allies had out-predicted the storm itself. Their invasion had been launched not in defiance of the weather, but because of it. What the Germans saw as chaos, the Allies had read as opportunity. Every decision, from Stagg's ridge forecast to Eisenhower's midnight order, had hinged on that one fragile pocket of calm. By evening, as the first Allied reinforcements rolled inland and paratroopers linked up with beach units, Rommel issued orders for counterattacks that would come too late. Tanks bogged down in the marshy fields, artillery pieces struggled to find range through the mud, and the once proud Atlantic Wall began to crumble under the weight of inevitability. In the shattered headquarters at St. Lo, a German major summed it up in a whisper that no one could refute. "We laughed at the weather and it laughed back." Outside, the rain began again, a reminder of how quickly fortune shifts when men mistake storms for certainty. June 7th, 1944. Dawn over the Normandy coast. The storm that had once raged across the channel was breaking apart, its remnants curling into scattered banks of fog that drifted low over the newly won beaches. The wind still carried the tang of cordite and seawater. In the shallow surf, the bodies of soldiers and the wrecks of landing craft rocked gently, their motion slow and solemn, the sea reclaiming what it had been forced to yield. Above that quiet ruin came the steady pulse of engines. Allied transport planes crossed overhead in tight formation, delivering supplies, reinforcements, and field medics to the new foothold on continental Europe. The invasion, the greatest ever undertaken, was now a fact. The gamble on weather had not only worked, it had rewritten the logic of warfare itself. Back in England, the men who had predicted that gamble sat in silence. At the meteorological office near Dunstable, Group Captain James Stagg removed his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He had slept barely an hour since June 3rd. In the corner, the barograph still scratched its thin black line across a roll of paper, a perfect record of the storm's rise and fall. A young WAF officer entered the room carrying a telegram from Chafe headquarters. She handed it to Stagg without a word. He unfolded it slowly. "Operation successful. Landings proceeding. Forecast accurate. Well done." For a moment he simply stared at the words as if afraid they might vanish. Around him, his fellow meteorologists, men who had argued, doubted, calculated, and recalculated for days, stood frozen. They had not heard gunfire, had not waded through surf or faced enemy fire, yet without their predictions, every soldier who had landed on those beaches might have met the sea as an enemy rather than an ally. Stagg finally smiled, a small, exhausted smile, and said, "Then the wind was on our side after all." Eisenhower received the news at Southwick House just after 06 hour. The map room was filled with cigarette smoke and the hum of field radios. He leaned over the situation table as officers read out the latest dispatches. Utah secure. Gold advancing. Juneau holding. Omaha costly but stabilized. By mid-morning, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. He nodded once and exhaled, a sound halfway between a sigh and a prayer. "That'll do," he said quietly. "That'll do." The Supreme Commander had made a decision that defied every instinct of caution. His faith in a handful of meteorologists, and the sliver of calm they had promised, had changed the course of history. "We must thank the weathermen," he told one of his aides later that day. "They saved us from guessing wrong." In Berlin, the same storm that had blinded the Germans now mocked them with its retreat. Luftwaffe. Weather Service officers, pale and sleepless, pored over their maps in disbelief. Their models had missed the ridge entirely, a subtle shift in the jet stream that Stagg's team had caught using ship reports from as far west as Iceland. The oversight was small, but in war, small things decide empires. The storm had been the shield under which the Allies crossed. Its temporary easing had been invisible to German instruments. For Rommel, it was a bitter revelation. Standing amid the wreckage of his forward headquarters near Caen, he watched Allied aircraft sweep overhead unopposed. The weather favored them, he said, more to himself than anyone else, and we laughed at their folly. He shook his head almost admiringly. They did not wait for perfection. They waited for possibility. By June 8th, the channel was once again a restless plain of gray. The narrow meteorological window had closed, as Stagg had warned it would. Rain and gales returned, lashing the coast for 3 more days, conditions that would have made a crossing suicidal. The invasion had slipped through the eye of the storm by less than 12 hours. History's hinge had turned on a handful of barometric readings and one man's quiet conviction that nature could not be conquered, only understood. In the years that followed, Eisenhower would often speak of those tense hours in the Southwick map room. When asked what he remembered most from D-Day, he never mentioned the roar of the guns or the sight of the Armada. He would pause, lean back, and say, "I remember the wind." He remembered the way it howled outside the windows while Stagg stood before him, calm and certain, describing a fleeting chance, a ridge that would last less than 2 days. If he'd been wrong, Eisenhower once said, we'd have sent thousands of men to die in the sea. But he wasn't wrong. The sea gave us its grace, and so the legend of D-Day was written not only in courage and sacrifice but in patience, in the quiet vigilance of men who watched clouds, who listened to wind pressure and wave patterns, who understood that sometimes the fate of nations depends on a pause between storms. June 6th had begun as a night of rain and doubt. It ended as the dawn of liberation. The German generals who had mocked the forecast learned too late what the Allies already knew, that in war, as in weather, fortune favors those who respect the storm.